She'll be keeping us safe. Speaking of safety, you want to make sure your body is in the tram at all times. If you're wearing a hat, please keep it on firmly so it doesn't blow off. You also want to make sure you have good sun protection. We're going to be in the sun this entire time. As we get headed out, we've been the National Park Service, who I work for, we've been around 100 years. This is our 100th anniversary, but Yosemite's been around 150 years. Do you think people have changed much in 150 years? Something, so you say yeah. So maybe people have changed, but there's some things we still do the same. We're still eating, we're still playing, we're still working, we still create art. But how we do those things has changed because of technology. Humans change, over, hundreds, thousands of years, and technology is changing exponentially. For instance, how many of you remember a time being alive before the internet? All right. How about before the electronic calculator? Okay, less people. What about before nylon and the jet plane? So before World War II? So yeah, we had some folks that were around that long in the last one. But we're going to take a little tour back in time and talk about how technology has impacted visitor experience at the park. But as we do, take a look behind you at Yosemite Falls, the largest waterfall in all of the United States. So there's really no place in the park that I think best represents how technology literally and metaphorically creates new connections to Yosemite Valley, other than Camp 4, which we're passing right now. It was put on the National Historic Register in the 2000s because of the innovations and the technology and techniques developed there. Have any of you heard of Black Diamond and Patagonia? Raise your hand. Alright, so some of you have probably been to REI or some outdoor stores. Well, those companies got started by a man named Yvon Chouinard, and he got his start here dirtbagging at Camp 4 back in the 50s. Those companies, that gear he developed, all came out of Yosemite. Yosemite is kind of like the place where rock climbing developed, of any places in the world. Now, we got our start rock climbing, you could say, with John Muir, who's a famous conservationist. You want to keep your hands in the vehicle if you don't want to lose your arm. And basically he climbed up in the high country, a place called Cathedral Peak in 1860s. And he did it without any equipment. He was free soloing, that's what we call it today. And there are a lot of other places in the park that seemed impossible to climb at that time. In fact, the state geologist, Josiah Whitney, in 1870, said, Half Dome, no human is ever going to step foot on that thing. That's impossible to climb. Well, in 1875, we had a blacksmith, former sailor named Anderson, and he actually climbed up to the top. Took him a few attempts. One time he tried to cover himself in sack and just jumped in, climbed like a frog or something. It didn't work too well, but eventually got our ropes, and the Sierra Club led trips. Over time, we developed new technology for climbing. 75 years later, we had another blacksmith named Salathé, and he climbed up that peak right there, Sentinel Peak. He did that in 1950, and he did that by creating his own pitons. Pitons are these metallic wedges that you kind of hammer into the cracks that you're climbing up. And once you get above that, it's basically what holds your rope if you fall. You hammer them back out, but that damaged the rock. Now, usually you start to damage the piton, but he created his pitons out of really creative material, basically Ford Model T axles. And so they're very solid steel, very strong, and that helped him make such a large climb up that Sentinel Peak. Now, Salathé eventually, just a few years later, in the 50s, would become the mentor to two of the most audacious climbers in climbing history. Two people with diametrically opposed personalities. We had Royal Robbins on the one hand, poet, philosopher, intense moralist, and Warren Harding, named after the president, and he was a lover of alcohol, a lover of women, a lover of sports car, and a lover of staying home with mom on the weekends. And Royal Robbins, he decided to really do the impossible. People had hiked up to the top of Half Dome, but no one ever went up that sheer 2,000-foot cliff on the northwest face. It's really famous. And he's like, I'm going to try that out. I have no idea if I'm going to survive. Once we get up high enough, there's no way to come back down. And so what he did is he assembled a team of two people, and they basically set up different pitches and camped out. It was one of the first times climbers would camp out on a big wall, and he had to sleep in a hammock 1,000 feet off the ground. It took him 5 days to get up to the top, and again, there's no coming back down. It became kind of a record of climbing at that time for anyone to do something so spectacular. Now, Warren Harding, he was a bit competitive, and he was like, oh, that Robbins guy, he thinks he can do that. Well, I'm going to up him. What I'm going to do is go over to El Cap. That's over 3,000 feet tall. And Robbins at the time thought that would have been impossible, and he's like, I'm going to get up there. And he used a method called the siege method, where it's basically you set up a couple ropes, one for your own protection, and one to lift up gear, so you don't have to carry it with you. And he got delivered all kinds of goodies when he's up there. He got some gin, he got a whole roast turkey 1,500 feet up while he was climbing that wall. It took him 42 days on and off over 18 months to design that route to get up there using those pitons and something called expansion bolts. And that's like a bolt you hit into the wall and twist and hit it again, and eventually expands and gets stuck. Now, that causes actually some damage to the rock. It's also called mixed gear. It stays in the wall, and for some people, they began not to like that. They thought it was kind of cheating, especially if you're getting delivered up full roast turkeys while you're 1,000 feet off the ground. So Robbins is kind of like, man, this is so artful, so uncreative. I'm going to show him and do all the other walls in El Cap. So he goes about and does that with Yvon Chouinard, the creator of Patagonia and Black Diamond, and they make it up. The wall's called North America Wall. As you look to your right, you'll see El Cap. Eventually, you'll see like a dark gray spot that's it looks like North America. That's the wall they climbed up. Just for perspective, this wall is about 3 Empire State Buildings tall. And we'll hopefully get to see some climbers today, contemporary climbers. The part that's right at the edge is called the nose. You may be able to notice there's kind of like an alcove up at the top, and it kind of bends down like a curved nose. To me, it looks like an elephant in a trunk. And so, that was Royal Robbins showing off to Harding. Well, around that time too, Robbins went over to Europe, and what he found is in Europe they started using these things called nuts. They're kind of like the nuts you have when you're stirring stuff, with a little aluminum thing on them for basically people to put the rope through, and that doesn't damage the rock. It's easier to take out of the rock too, and it's called clean climbing when you use that gear because it's not causing damage. And he became a huge advocate of using this gear. Meanwhile, Yvon Chouinard, he started developing the nuts here in America and the hexes, which became replacements in many ways for the pitons. But Harding, eventually he decided not to go along with Robbins' philosophy of climbing, which is climbing the first ascent, being the first one up is an art form. It's like writing a poem, and every piton you hit in is a different word. And the more words you have that clutter up that poem, the uglier it is. Harding wasn't an artist or a philosopher. He liked farce. He actually created a club that was called like climbing, drinking, and farcing. And basically, he decided to do quite the incredible thing out here. So yeah, he first climbed up the nose. Took him 42 days. Robbins did it in 1 week. The next thing Harding would do would be the Dawn Wall, the Wall of Early Light, which we're looking at right now. Again, another wall thought to be impossible because of how few cracks were in it to place protection. So here at the Dawn Wall, this is where Harding climbed up. He did follow one of Robbins' rules where you can't just keep coming up and down. You have to do it in one shot. And he actually made it up halfway, but he had already run the time limit he had established for how much food and water to bring up. Again, if you're climbing these things, you have to bring up all your water, all your food, and you also have to figure out where you're going to sleep and where you're going to go to the bathroom. You have to take all of that with you. And so, yeah, he climbed up this wall. You can see a climber over there on the right. You can see, I think it looks like a portaledge, a red portaledge, kind of behind that tall tree. Might need to move forward a little more.
Oh, I see.
But yeah, you look up there between these big trees in the front and the smaller tree with all those plants that are growing on the wall, you can see that portaledge. So when Harding was up halfway up the wall, there was a huge thunderstorm that was coming through.
I got you.
And the Park Service decided to send helicopters to rescue him. And when the helicopters started to come, Warren threw down a can. They picked up the can. There's a little message inside. It's like, no, you're not going to pick me up. I'm going to make it to the top. And it took him about 10 more days, and he made it to the top with his partner. And when he got up there, he said, I don't know who's the conqueror and who's the conquered. Because if you look at the wall, it looks a lot better than I do right now. Anyways, he got tons of publicity for being the first one to climb up this wall, for evading a helicopter rescue. And Robbins was furious. He's like, okay, he got the wall, but he didn't do it right. And this guy, this clown, who's not even taking it seriously, gets all the credit. Well, I'm going to show him off. He did it in like 3 weeks. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do it quicker. And so he starts to climb up with a partner. And as he does, he didn't tell his partner this, he starts to sabotage the different bolts that were placed into the rock. Started clipping them off. It's like, I'm doing this to make a point. No one's going to do this again. He put 300 bolts in this wall. That's one every 10 feet. That's not how you climb. That's cheating. It's an ugly art form. By the time he got a few hundred feet up, he realized, hey, this guy actually did have style. This is a really hard wall. It wasn't just making it easy. He did a good job. And they left the rest in. But after that, Warren Harding and Royal Robin, they were like, we're kind of tired of doing this whole big wall thing, having this competition. And that ended what's called the golden age of climbing. Now later, climbers would develop new ways of climbing these walls here at Yosemite, and one was called speed climbing. Speed climbing is trying to do a climb very quickly. And so with speed climb, for instance, the nose, again, first time done 42 days. Jim Bridwell in the 70s, the days of Jim while doing drugs, he did it in 1 day. He got the record back then in the 70s, one of the best climbers here in Yosemite's history. We also had a type called free climbing. Most climbing that Robbins and Harding did, they used aids. You kind of put protective gear in the wall, and you kind of hang your lower body on them. So it's not like you're holding your body up with your hands and feet the entire time. The wall is supporting you. So some people said, if you can do it better with less technology, then do it. And so in the 90s, we had the first person to ever get up the nose without aids. And her name was Lynn Hill. She really put her name on the wall, not only as a climber, but also as a woman, being one of the best female climbers here in Yosemite's history. And she actually started climbing up with a partner. They got to the top, they saw a piton in there, and they had her rest their body so she could pull it out. And she's like, oh man, I cheated. I'm going to have to do this again. So she went back down the next day and did it again without that piton there. In fact, she came back a few years later and tried to outdo herself and did the whole thing in 1 day, again, 3,600 some feet, with just her arm and leg strength. So finally, another type of form of climbing we have here at the park is called free soloing. It's kind of a throwback to what John Muir was doing, where you don't have any protective gear. And we had someone named Alex Honnold. If you ever watched 60 Minutes, maybe you remember that episode where he went up the northwest face of Half Dome, 2,000 feet, without any rope, without any climbing partner, without any protective gear. All he had was a chalk bag. Climbed all the way up there without falling. One more move would have been done for. So most climbers today will take about 3 to 5 days to get to the top of El Cap. But I have a roommate who's the climbing ranger here. He can do it in a day. So the better you are, the more incredible you are. Speaking of which, what do you think the speed climbing record is for the nose here at El Cap? Any guesses? Jim Bridwell did it in 1 day. What do you think it is now?
6 hours. 6 hours!
12 hours, 6 hours? So if you believe it or not, it's actually about 2 hours and 23 minutes.
Oh, come
so
on.
the time it takes us to go on this tour, some climbers are able to go up all the way to the top with a partner.
Let's go.
Pretty incredible. Again, the average person takes 3 to 5 days, so it's pretty incredible technique to have. That's actually what Alex Honnold did, not just the free soloing on Half Dome, but he got that record here. He's actually done it's called the Triple Crown, where in 1 day he climbed all the way up El Cap, all the way up Half Dome, and all the way up Mount Watkins in the park in 18 and a half hours. super athletes, these guys are. Does anyone have any questions?
What's this ridge over here?
Yeah, so what is this? So yeah, that's the Cathedral Peaks. Yeah. So, something to take a look around you is the type of rock we're going through. It's a reason climbers like to climb on it, but sometimes they don't like climbing on it, and you might hear them scream a 4-letter word. Does anyone know what that is? It's spelled R-O-C-K, rock. Because if anything starts to fall from that wall, even if it's the size of a peanut, that thing can be falling 200 miles an hour, go right through your skull. So, but it's not just rock climbers who have to be careful with the rock fall in the park, it's also pedestrians. Rock fall is one of the most common erosional practices here of these walls. So I'm glad to tell you about that. But before we do, let's talk about the rock. How did it get here? So we're going to go back in our time machine,
How's the
100
point to
million
get a
years.
camera, Evan?
And so, welcome to
pretty
Jurassic
straight.
National Park. It's actually the
Thank you.
Cretaceous period, but you probably won't hear anyone talk about dinosaurs here again. So you can pretend to be your dinosaur, favorite dinosaur. But basically underneath your leathery dinosaur feet, 5 miles below the ground, there's giant pockets of radiating red-hot liquid rock called magma that's fueling volcanoes 20,000 feet tall, like down by the Andes. Those volcanoes are erupting, creating an entire mountain chain. Now, eventually, that's going to be shut off, that volcanic system, and the volcanoes are going to erode and turn into dirt and wash into the Central Valley and be inverted and upside down. Now, all of this granite here is made from that molten rock that eventually gets pushed up to replace all of those previous volcanoes. And it has, because it takes thousands of years to cool, it has large crystals and they interlock, so they're extremely strong. But they're not strong enough to prevent them from breaking. And that's how rockfall happens. It's called exfoliation. It's kind of like, when you're using soap on your skin or you get dandruff coming off, except that dandruff weighs 100,000 tons. And so basically that's what happens to the rock, and that stuff can be pretty dangerous. Back in 1987, we had our largest rock fall in the park history. It was 15,000 volume. The volume was 15,000 buses, school buses. So imagine 15,000 school buses piled somewhere below these cliffs. That's how much rock fell in just about 24 hours. Now, in 1996, we had rockfall from near Happy Isles, and it actually fell so far directly down, it created hurricane winds 240 miles an hour, blew down 1,000 trees, and it had one fatality. In 2008, at Halftone Village, we had a student housing. Rocks fell on that, crushed the student housing. Fortunately, no students were involved, but after that happened, we decided to hire scientists to figure out where we should have buildings and where we shouldn't. So we had to figure out the frequency at which these rocks fall. And in order to do so, we had to understand and date the rocks. So speaking of dating, here's Bridal Veil Falls. And this is actually one of the indicators in a big duel between John Muir, who was a sheep herder at the time and someone who cut wood, and the state geologist Josiah Whitney, about how this valley is created, earthquake or glaciers. Well, if you see there, it looks like a valley. It's called a hanging valley, and the whole Yosemite Valley is another huge valley. Well, this had a giant glacier coming through it because it was following the path of the Merced River, which may have been here for at least 5 million years, carving into this valley. The glaciers widened it, made it a U-shape, but that glacier up there never fell all the way down. So now today we have this and many other waterfalls here in the park. Now, going back to dating rocks, another thing that we can see here is a moraine. That's the terminal moraine. It's how far the glacier is able to push off all the debris underneath it before it melted and receded. There's also rocks that we date and locate called xenoliths. That means they traveled very far. Some of these rocks have traveled 60 miles to get down in the valley, which means a glacier had scraped it off the ground and pushed it here. Now, to date those rocks, as well as some of these rocks on the side that have fallen off the cliffs, geologists still don't have an app like Tinder for dating rocks. So basically, geologists use something fancier called cosmogenic radionuclide dating, which I'm sure all of you are very well aware of. Basically what that means is we find out how long this rock's been sitting here disconnected from the wall. It has been being hit by cosmic rays from supernovas thousands of light years away. Because those rays actually add elements into the atomic structure of the granite. And then we put it in a lab, we put acid into it, mix it around, something you could do at home if you have a accelerator mass spectrometer. And basically they're able to figure out how much of this element is in there and how long it's been around. So with the help of some astrophysics and accelerator mass spectrometers, we've been able to determine where the most dangerous rockfall is, and we've relocated buildings and campsites because of it. Now another big threat in the park, of course, this is just a rockfall. It's the river, the Merced River. Again, it's been carving out this valley for, I'll just say, millions of years. And you can kind of tell this time of the year in the spring where it's extra fast, extra vigorous. It's white, swift water, and that carries pebbles with it, and it floats out into the stream banks and such. And here again, you can see one of these moraines, how it kind of goes up. The reason the valley's so flat is because of all these floods that came out of the glaciers, and they deposited a bunch of silt and talus down here. And basically, the valley itself, the granite walls, go another couple thousand feet below where we're standing right now. So we're kind of like elevated above the true valley by all this rock debris from those glaciers. So yeah, here's the Merced River, and we're about to stop at Valley View. Something you should know is that, again, rock climbing seems really dangerous, and it is, but there's many more fatalities from actually drowning in this river. Once you get caught by some of this white water, you can get sucked under a little bit and get stuck under a boulder. And we don't want that to be happening to you, so please be careful when you exit, and don't get too much in the water. We also have a restroom stop here.
Oh, awesome.
We'll probably be here about 10 minutes, so please go to the restroom first if you need to. You'll be exiting on your right, so please wait till we come to a complete stop. There'll be a boardwalk. You can exit by kind of walking down backwards so you can hold on to the metal. I'm happy to answer questions for you in the meantime, but yeah, I hope you enjoy some of the beauty here.
Floodwater level.
Yeah, I remember.
January 2nd, 1997. We had what's considered Yosemite's greatest natural disaster since it's been a park here. And what happened is we happened to have an unusual amount of snow that year. We had about 12-foot snowpack up in the high Sierras. And that's where all this water is coming from. It's coming up from the meadows and all that that's 8,000 feet and higher up. And not only did we have a huge snowpack, but just on like New Year's Eve, basically we had a tropical storm come through from Hawaii. And not only did that bring in warm air, it also brought in rain. And it rained for 24 hours, poured for 24 hours. So if you imagine the rain pouring down the snow melting, how much water must have started to run off these waterfalls. They were like fire hydrants, I've been told, from people who've been here, just blasting water out. I think someone said they even saw a log tumble over, a newly felled tree fall over one of those waterfalls. Huge damage. We were like $178 million of damage to the park. The damage was so severe, it broke apart like an electrical facility, broke sewage lines. Some of the buildings were under several feet of water, and we had to evacuate staff. In fact, the whole valley, Yosemite Valley, was closed for 3 months. 2 campgrounds were washed away, and it would take us about 10 years before we recovered our previous visitation, which is about 4 million people. It wasn't until just last year, I think, that we hit 4 million again, after that terrible flood in 1997. You can see the gauging station over to your left, and here's a bridge. Just for perspective, this bridge was underwater. The water was hitting the bridge. That's how high it was going. And this is, of course, it's kind of scary, but it's also a natural event. It's what's called a 100-year flood. This is a whole thing is a floodplain. So it's kind of funny for the managers of the park to decide where they can actually put buildings. You're either going to get hit by a rock or you're going to be flooded in a few years. So there's a lot of conflict and sensitivity over where things are built and such. But yeah, you should be very grateful for the Merced for having some mercy and leaving the rest of the park here. And that's because the Merced and the Tuolumne rivers, they both feed into the San Joaquin, and that goes to the Bay Area. So all the produce and vegetables, fruit, nuts, some of your drinking water, if you're from California, comes from these rivers. Now, what's funny is, in order to protect the river, not like, we kind of need protecting from it too, but we also want to protect the river. We're actually going to be removing some roads here in the park eventually. When it took a lot of labor and love to actually create the roads we have here at the park today. Have any of you ever thought about how the roads get here in the park? They don't just appear out of nowhere, right? Some of the first Euro-American visitors to the park went back to the 1850s. There was an army expedition through this valley, and they told of these marvelous wonders. So a few years later, an entrepreneur and journalist named James Hutchings led an expedition. He had an Indian guide, and they took him here in 1855, and he got to see it with his own eyes. After 21 days of trying to find it, he had to ride on horseback. There was no roads or anything whatsoever out here, completely undeveloped. But after that, he wanted to publish this article about it, and unfortunately, he had a painter with him named Nair, and he published an article with that painting. And after that, hundreds of tourists started to come over the next only 10 years, so not a whole lot. But given that there were no roads at the time, that's still pretty impressive. Now, he wanted to build and develop this area and make a bunch of money, and he certainly did. Now, he wasn't the only person to come here, however. There were also being built roads later on in the 70s after this had been established as a state park by the federal government. And what happened is we had roads starting to be built so more and more people could visit. So we had the Coulterville Road over yonder to the north that was built. Man spent at the time was something like $77,000. So a lot back then. Anything being half back, because at the same time somebody else was challenging his monopoly and building the Big Oak Flats Road, which we currently use a new version of. And basically that was the preferred carriage road to get into the park. Now at the same time, in the late 1870s, we also had the Lamona Road being built, and I'll point that out as we pass it in just a little bit. It will be on your right after we take a turn. Or wait, on your left. So what happened is they needed a lot of laborers. Well, the whole reason there were a lot of people in California at the time was something happened in 1848. The discovery of gold. There's a huge gold rush, and at the time in China, there's famine, there's drought, a lot of social issues too, and he had a bunch of people just like today coming over as immigrants to make a living and send money back home to support their families. And they built the road coming up in your left called Old Lamona Road, and they had to do so in 4.5 months in the winter winter with pickaxes, shovels. They didn't have any animal labor. The reason they started building these roads and doing this really hard labor was because gold became less common, and a law was passed to actually put an extra tax on foreigners if you're gold miners. So a lot of the Chinese left that business and entered big chefs or building roads here around Yosemite. I'm very grateful for this road here. Now it's trail to Inspiration Point, but that wasn't how everyone felt at the time. By the 1800s, just a few years after the roads were built by the Chinese, the government passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which not only banned Chinese immigration in the country, specifically targeting their nationality, but it actually made it impossible for any of them to become legal, naturalized citizens in the United States. Just a few years ago, both the federal government and the state of California have apologized for that act and recognized the contributions Chinese have made to California and, the United States in general. So, after people started coming in by coach, and something nifty was invented called automobile, and thanks to that, all you here are here today. Now, we also had a train that went from the Merced to El Portal, and people would take a stagecoach to go into the valley. But just a few years later, they opened up, they allowed cars in, and immediately visitation went up twice. And as many people were coming by road on the all-American, or the all-Muir Highway, which you come in on from El Portal, as from the train. By the 20s, they had that road in it, the railroad basically shut down. It shut down after World War II, because so many people were coming in by car. When the park was first being developed, you actually had people be like, yeah, bring the cars in, we want the masses to support this park. When the National Park Service took over in the 1916, it was like, well, our mission is to both be there for visitor enjoyment and preserve the resource, and we want to be careful with traffic. By the 1950s, after World War II, with the automobile, a bunch of soldiers coming back, a boom of wealth, all kinds of roads were being built through federal lands, and the director of the National Park Service was worried that our parks were being loved to death. Flash forward to 1970, we actually come up with a management plan to make a single road here in Yosemite Valley and add the shuttle stops so that there'd be less traffic and pollution, environmental degradation. 10 years later, 1980, another management report comes up and says traffic is the #1 threat to Yosemite Valley. And eventually, someday, there'll be no cars here because we don't want them. That hasn't been achieved yet, but with the new Merced River plan that was put up a couple years ago, there is a plan that possibly in a couple decades, you'll need to make a reservation to even visit Yosemite Valley. Not to camp here, but actually visit it, because of the limitation of how many people and cars can be here. So here's some really great views coming up. Again, brought to you by these roads and cars. Now, cars weren't the major threat to Yosemite in the early days. There was a much more dire threat that the valley came under than the cars. And that's because a lot of people had tunnel vision. They could only see the short-term profits. Speaking of tunnel vision, you'll see a tunnel here in the 1933 by the City Conservation Corps. It was the longest tunnel in the country at the time, almost a mile long. But it really would take artists to have that artistic vision to federally set aside land just for visitor enjoyment and recreation. So we'll talk more about that when you hop back on. And for the time being, enjoy your own artistic expression, taking photos here of tunnel view. So again, please be careful as you exit. We're going to be here maybe about 10 minutes. We have some water for you if you're thirsty. And enjoy.
Run across.
How many pictures do you have some of you taken so far on this tour? 40, hundreds? Anyone else? So believe it or not, if you were the first photographer here at Yosemite Valley, it would have taken you 10 minutes just to take a single photograph. And it would have been costly. You can take as many photos as you want digitally. It's not going to cost you extra. You're not going to have toxic chemicals all over your hand. You don't have to develop those photos immediately in a darkroom like Mr. Watkins in 1861. But if it weren't for these artists who took these pictures, who made these paintings, we may not have our national parks here today in the United States or anywhere else in the world. So the national park idea came from artists who were very concerned about the state of things. You see, at the beginning of the 1800s, the Romantic movement of art in Europe was just coming to an end, and it was coming to the United States. So you had a lot of painters like Thomas Cole who proposed the idea that maybe we should have a federally reserved land for the wild landscape and the animals, even the American Indians to live on when he was visiting the Midwest. He was terrified that all this was going to be developed by farmland and cut all the trees and forests cut down. And there's a whole movement of artists who wanted to capture this idea of man and nature living in harmony versus the human as the agitator and conqueror of nature, which was the feeling and sentiment at the time with Manifest Destiny. Develop the land, show that America's the best. And basically, what started to happen around the 1860s, you had the Homestead Act being passed by Abraham Lincoln amidst the Civil War, trying to get family farmers out into the western part of the country, fighting the idea of slavery, where you have large plantations owned by a few people. And basically, the Homestead Act, people got about 160 acres, and they farm the land, it becomes there. And in order to get people out there too, you had railroads. Railroads, the carts are made out of wood, the tracks are made out of wood, they're fueled by wood. A tremendous amount of trees were being cut down. And a lot of people were concerned that was going to happen out west, especially after seeing this beautiful valley. Deforestation and all of that. There were also some big trees, the sequoias, redwoods being cut down. And one man by the name of Frederick Olmsted, he was one of the engineers who developed Central Park in New York City. And he had moved out here into his friend's Fremont's little house. It's a pretty big house, actually. And he was like, we can't let this happen to Yosemite Valley. This place is beautiful. Look what happened in Niagara Falls. There's tourist trap, people walking on tightrope all the time, doing stunts. Like, this isn't a carnivalesque place. We want this to be a beautiful wild place. So he basically took some of the photos that Mr. Watkins took, Earl Watkins, took in minutes to develop each of those photos with these glass plates. And then have film back then. You had to develop your photos, and also what a camera at that time. You had to bring it in with you. So not only did he have to pay money for the glass and mix with 6 different types of toxic chemicals and the glass plates he had, but he also had to carry a tent that would be completely shut off all the light from outside. So he needed 12 mules that he carried around with him in order to take some of those fabulous photos of these mammoth glass plates, large thing. He also did something called the stereoscope, where they take these simultaneous images and he can look through like these glasses to see a three-dimensional type image. Look at depth. And those images were actually used by a congressman to go to Abraham Lincoln in the midst of the Civil War and be like, hey, we need to reserve this land. If we don't, it might be destroyed. And President Lincoln took time to actually take a look at those photos and sign what would become the Yosemite Grant. And basically what that effectively did in 1864 was the federal government gave this land over to the state of California to manage. So it's more or less like a state park. But it wasn't always managed super well. It became quickly developed by one of those first people who saw the valley, James Hudson, and a bunch of other places that started to put up roads. They started to have much of the meadow drained so they could have hay development to give the horses, so it'd be cheaper to bring horses in. They wanted to drain it so they could also have livestock grazing around. There were goats all the way up on the high country, eating up all the wildflowers and plants indiscriminately. It was becoming a mess. People were cutting down trees, putting up fences for the animals, and they're like, wait a sec, this is turning into like a zoo. And meanwhile, the Yosemite Grant Commission wanted to extend the park's boundaries to the watersheds, and people were like, no, you're not going to do that. You're just going to mess it up. So basically, Around that time, you also had John Muir. Now, he was a naturalist, as an inventor. He got malaria in Florida during one of his trips. He was trying to make it down to South America. Ended up deciding to come to California instead because he heard about this in James Hutchins' publication. Came over here. He's like, where can I go to the wilderness? They pointed this way. Came here, fell in love, and basically became the naturalist, one of the protectors here in the park. And with his help and some journalists' help, they ended up getting the federal government to set aside all the surrounding land here at Yosemite to be a national park in 1890. So you still have the Yosemite Valley and the Mariposa Grove as a state park inside national park boundaries. So something to consider with all that is basically we still had the problem of Yosemite Valley not being part of the national park. Fortunately, around 1903, Mr. President Theodore Roosevelt came through and decided to do a backpacking type trip with John Muir. They had a lot of great conversations, including about the future of forests and parks in the country, and they came to a deal. Where basically Theodore Roosevelt allowed some borders part of the national park be set aside as national forest for people to mine, and that's all the non-granitic rock. And then California would give us the Yosemite Valley and the Mariposa Grove back, and that was 1906. In the meantime, there's no National Park Service to manage the land, so we actually had buffalo soldiers here for a couple summers. Buffalo soldiers were basically freed slaves who fought during the Civil War, and they also continued to fight for the federal government and protect federal lands. They fought a lot of the American Indian wars, but they also protected this land from poachers and other type of people. So around 1916, before the Park Service even came into effect, no one really knew exactly what the parks were supposed to do. There was a question of values, and San Francisco just had a huge earthquake, and they wanted to get water. And so in 1913, there was a kind of battle between John Muir, a bunch of conservationists, and people in San Francisco of whether they'd dam up Hetch Hetchy, which Muir compared to the same beauty as Yosemite Valley. In fact, he considered it like a cathedral. How dare people dam up, God's greatest church? To him, nature was his own church, and it's where he found God and his spirituality. Now, what ended up happening is they weren't able to stop the dam at Hetch Hetchy. Got dammed up. A few months later, it said John Muir died of a broken heart. Now, that didn't stop the conservation movement. You had more national parks being put up. You also had a movement toward not just having parks set aside, but after all the developments of roads during the the FDR administration as well as post-war events, people wanted to have a wilderness. They didn't want roads and all this other development. They wanted untrammeled space, places not dominated by humans' technology. So you had a movement there, and eventually they won. They got the Wilderness Act passed in 1964. That set aside a lot of federal land as wilderness areas protected by Congress to not be developed and have permanent developments. 20 years later, in 1984, Yosemite National Park became 94% wilderness. And just to emphasize how special that is, Yellowstone and the Grand Canyon, Glacier National Park, none of them have wilderness because it has to go through Congress, and as many of you know from living in America, that can take a long time. Now the other thing is the artistic movement didn't end either. You had one of the most famous landscape artists and photographers at the time, Ansel Adams, who developed his photography here. Came here, took a picture, first one, at Valley View, where you're at, with his brownie. At that time, film had been invented. And he would go on to work for the Sierra Club and do high Sierra hikes into the backcountry camps. He really became famous and an exceptional artist after taking a particular photo. Made have heard of it, monolith. It was a half dome, and it basically made it look almost like a bizarre extraterrestrial landscape with the filters he used. Now, at that point, he said what he realized is that he could picture what he wanted to feel and what he felt, that image he had, and then try to replicate that with a camera. So he went on to try to use no filter at all and do pure photography, just like some climbers went on to try to do clean climbing. And eventually in 1938, one of the photos he had taken of Kings Canyon to the south by Sequoia National Park, that would be used again in Congress to help create Kings Canyon National Park. Again, thanks to a photograph of Kings Canyon National Park, and conservationists were able to save a beautiful river valley from being dammed up. Now, just as, for instance, with Ansel Adams, as he talked about, he had an image in his mind that felt really good, and he wanted to make that a reality. Well, sometimes when we think about wilderness and nature, it's kind of the same thing. We have this image and feeling about Yosemite Valley, and that doesn't always match up the actual history. The stories we tell sometimes feel good and are better than the actual occurrences that happen. You know, what's included in the frame of our stories and what's cropped out. Well, for some folks, the whole concept of a wilderness, an untouched place without human habitation, is kind of like a crowning wildfire, something that kills everything on the floor, including the native roots. And as you look around, you'll actually notice some signs of fire here in the park, and that's from what we do at Prescribed Burns. For over 100 years, generally Euro-Americans thought fire was pretty bad. It killed trees and all that. What we know now is it's actually pretty good for ecosystem and improves biodiversity. It also prevents mega giant fires like we had the Ring Fire in California, lots of news at all. The largest wildfire in California's history. That was just, I think, a couple years ago. So, this wasn't something developed and invented by Euro-Americans. This burning in the valley here had been going on for at least 600 years from the native inhabitants. They called themselves the Awanichi. That's from the name Awani, for gaping mouth. These are the inhabitants of this valley. And for them, they believe they've lived here time immemorial, and we have at least enough archaeological evidence to suggest it's been many, many thousands of years. And they manage this valley, and the whole reason you have the meadows today is because of their burns. They really use those meadows. For instance, a lot of the trees we're seeing right now, we just passed a black oak. It has a really dark black corrugated bark, the lobed leaves. They drop acorns. That was their main food. A lot of people think of American Indians. They go, oh yeah, great hunters. And many of them were. But a major food source for a lot of them were plants, whether corn or here in California, acorns. And they ground it up into mush. That was their staple, kind of like corn and wheat and soy are for us. So it really depended on that. And those do really well in those wide open sunny meadows. If you don't burn them, you start having trees like these growing, which are a combination of, there's a Doug fir, a lot of ponderosa pines, those orangish trees. The ones that look like sequoias, those are red cedars. Now they did use those trees too. The red cedars, they strip off the bark, and they use that to build these conical homes. They also use that for fire. There's another black oak right there. And they also use grasses to make baskets, and they use tree pitch to actually make them waterproofed. And they trade. They're huge trade networks. Some people think there were 100 million Americans before the Europeans had arrived in the 1500s, living in North and South America, and most of them had been wiped out by disease and warfare just within 100 or 200 years. However, a lot of them still continue to live. They struggled against the colonization. We had people, for instance, from the coast under Spanish rule who started to come up to the Sierra to intermingle and escape from some of the disease and forced slavery. And a lot of their cultures blended. But they had already been trading fish from the coast for baskets and acorns from here. Also the manzanita berry for cider. And they also, the Awanichi also traded with the Paiute up in the East Sierras. And they got, in return, obsidian, that volcanic glass that's extremely sharp. They also got bison hides and pinyon pine nuts and salt. So it was a huge trade network. There's a lot of civilization here. And a lot of that was eventually destroyed, especially after 1848, when you had 40,000 immigrants coming in from around the world, but specifically from the Midwest and South to make it big with the gold rush. It actually created conflict because they started to encroach on the Awanichi and other Indians' land. And Awanichi allegedly thought about creating a union to come together and fight off the European settlers. Now, when the California heard about that, they ended up creating a battalion of 200 people to try to, non-violently as possible, put them onto a reservation in Fresno. No one ended up getting treaty rights or the reservation. I mean, if you lived in Yosemite Valley, would you want to move to Fresno on a reservation? Probably not, right? It's pretty beautiful here. And so, yeah, they didn't. They were hunted down by the battalion. Their village was burned down. The chief's son, one of them, was killed. Eventually brought over to the reservation and again released. The 7 affiliate tribes with Yosemite, none of them have any federal recognition, which is really not so great for them because there's lots of benefits that come with that. So what ended up happening is they ended up coming back to the park, though, while it was still the Yosemite Grant before it was federally controlled by the Park Service. But they could no longer hunt and they could no longer practice their burning. So they had to end up becoming dependent on the canned food that was imported, the clothing that was imported into the valley, as well as for jobs in the valley. Women became maids and house servants. The men chopped on wood. They also built roads. And, you know, again, if it weren't for the Awanichi, you wouldn't have amazing, beautiful views like this of this meadow with Yosemite National, or Yosemite Falls right there. They created these meadow conditions. Right now we have about 80% forest, 20% meadow here. Back in the day, before the settlers came, it was 80% meadow and 20% forest. So it was actually even more beautiful than it was today, probably.
I did.
So what ended up happening with the people, though? One of the ideas of wilderness and manifest destiny that was a huge policy in the U.S. in the 1800s is that the Indians would just vanish, either because of war or they'd assimilate into, you know, the mainstream United States society. That didn't exactly happen. They continued to practice their culture, practice their religion, and their language. Although some of them were punished and were sent away as children to boarding schools out of state, hundreds of miles away, where they were forced to learn a different religion, speak a different language, and learn different trades for industries rather than stuff that they could sustain their lives on in nature. So when the Park Service took over, what they wanted to do, they're like, a lot of people really like the Indians here, so how about we have, in 1917, Field Indian Days, where we'll have rodeos, and we'll have beautiful baby competitions, and the Park Service actually paid some of the Awanichi and surrounding Indians to come here to participate in that, and some people were like, they don't seem Indian enough. So the Park Service actually brought in stuff people were used to seeing from the Plains Indians, brought a Plains Indians regalia, so that, oh yeah, that's what Indians look like. So eventually they shut those down because they thought that was really tacky, and people began to complain. But for a lot of the Indians of the valley, some of them have said that they actually enjoyed those because they actually got to mingle with a lot of other people who were coming through. Well, a lot of them also worked for the Park Service, but by the 1930s, different philosophy in the federal government began to develop, in which, how about we don't support the reservations anymore? Let's let Indians kind of fend for themselves and be individuals, which some people consider one of the most dramatic changes to American Indian policy in the country. So basically in the 30s, they're like, basically you have to work for the Park Service if you want to continue to live here. And so they actually built homes in the park by Camp 4, and the Awanichi moved in there. But by the 1950s, the policy had become, actually, we want to get all of these guys out of here. If anyone retires or dies from the Park Service, we're basically going to move them out of their home and we're going to burn them down. And so that's what they did. The last of those houses they developed in the 30s were burnt down in 1969. Some Awanichi still maintain relationships with the Park Service and volunteer at our cultural center, our museum. And you can learn more about their culture and their stories there if you're interested. Now that's not the end of the story. Relationships have gotten better. The Park Service does work with them. For instance, the Mariposa restoration we're doing now with the big sequoias, we're referencing the stories and the information the Awanichi, the Miwok, the Paiute want to share with us, convey for the Mariposa Grove. We also have done a ceremonial burn of some of these meadows with some of the native people. And that we actually use their kind of indigenous technology, the hand drill, where you have a stick and you kind of rub it and you make a coal and you're able to light kind of embers and start a fire. And we also have, they're able to do ceremonies in the roundhouse that's at the Indian Museum. However, that doesn't provide them any privacy. So they've been, for the last 20 years, fighting to develop a cultural center by Camp 4, where many of them had lived for, decades or hundreds of years even, their families. And that's where they're bumping up against technology again. Because they want to build it out of traditional materials and practice their culture. And the federal government, we want them to make sure it's safe and be up to building code violations or building codes and not violate them in case there's a fire hazard. So that's kind of stalled the project, but hopefully that will come through fairly soon. So we as the Park Service, or just conservationists in general, haven't always made the best decisions. But now that we're more connected than ever, we've had substantially more immigration. We're a much more diverse and conscientious society. And because of that, some of the changes within the national parks are reflecting that. For instance, Custer's Last Stand battlefield is now Battle of the Bighorn. It now acknowledges the lives lost and the history of the Lakota during the battles there. We also have Sand Creek Massacre National Historic Site in Colorado. It's a new site that acknowledges that. And Manzanar, it's a site in California that basically tells the story of Japanese who were kept in internment camps. Now, there's also changes going on in Yosemite Valley. After, you may remember, but last year, the very tragic events in North Carolina, the shooting at the church, many people lost their lives due to a hate crime. And as a response, many people voiced their outrage. National Park, they actually they asked their concession to stop selling merchandise with Confederate flags if it had no historical context. Here in Yosemite Valley, something similar has happened. We'll be passing up what was used to be called the LeConte Memorial. It was after a very famous, important geologist in California, as well as one of the charter members of the Sierra Club in its early days. But something less publicized, less well known, was that he was actually a big advocate in his day, right after the Civil War, of segregation, Jim Crow policies, social Darwinism, and white supremacy. So, due to those recent events last year, the Sierra Club and the National Park Service has decided to rename that to better actually reflect what the building does. The Conservation Heritage Center. So, yeah, not just natural processes are changing the park, but our social values as they change today. Again, you'll be seeing this building in just a moment on your right. It's actually made completely of granite. They have really wonderful talks on the weekends, lectures by scientists and such. This was the first visitor center in our park. It was run by the Sierra Club. Now, there's a lot of technologies that have developed that help us protect the park, or help visitors get to the park, like cars. But there's also a lot of technology that's really messing around with the park. So we'll talk a little bit about that, about our modification of the ecology. But perhaps one of the most representative, kind of fun but short-minded mistakes that the park had made was something called the firefall. Raise your hand if you've heard of the firefall. All right, somebody keep your hand up if you saw it. All right, none of you seen it. So it's supposedly one of the most spectacular things to see, but it wasn't the best for the environment. So basically, we're about to enter what used to be called Camp Curry, now it's Appleton Village. And it's right below Glacier Point. And if you look up, you'll actually see a tiny board-like structure at the top of that rock. There's actually a view. There's a photographer's rock and then Glacier Point position itself. And basically, you also can see some Half Dome. Again, that's where one of the first major climbs was in the park. And Alex Honnold, again, he climbed that free solo without any protection, all in one day. And so basically, they had a hotel up there in the late 1800s, and one of the men, he decided to have barbecues to basically entice people to come and stay at the hotel. And one night he finished the barbecue. He's like, we have all these embers and stuff. and just kicked them off the top of Glacier Point up there. You can see it really well now. And just imagine all those embers falling and just creating almost like each one's like a particle of water, except it's fire, and it's like a firefall instead of a waterfall. And just that dropping down for several seconds, probably even a minute, if there's a lot of it. And so he's like, yeah, well, that's the end of the night. Next day, some people walked up and they're like, hey, that was like the coolest thing you've ever done. And he's like, what? What are you talking about? And they're like, oh, the whole firefall thing. It's like, oh, that? They're like, yeah, are you going to do it again? He's like, sure, if you pay me $1.50. And that was a lot of money back then. So he collected all that money, and they went around and they basically collected money, and they collected red cedar wood to create those embers. And after they had done that, they continued that for a while. And when Camp Curry was established here, right below there, again, this is near where the rock fell. You can actually see some of that really white rock. That's a recent rock fall right there. All the gray and black you're seeing on the rock, that's actually life itself. That's lichen. Because otherwise it'd be a lot lighter of a color. So the whole valley, all the cliffs are alive with that stuff. And that was one of the problems with the firefall, is that when the embers started falling, it actually burnt off that lichen on the walls, which is habitat and food for some creatures. The other thing is when they're collecting all that cedar wood that's on the ground, that bark that burns really good, that again, that's food for insects, and those insects are food for other animals. So you start to remove the bottom of the food chain, and that's going to collapse the whole thing. The other major issue was traffic. And when cars came into the valley, there was an enormous amount of traffic for people who just wanted to see the firefall. And that was destroying the meadows, and it was also becoming a very unpleasant experience here at Yosemite National Park. So in 1968, the Park Service actually decided to end the firefall. And it was said within about a month or so of that decision, the hotel that was originally up there burnt down. Coincidence? I don't know. Another kind of strange coincidence type story mentioned about the Awanichi. One of the people who worked for the Park Service was one of the last people to leave the valley and move permanently outside of it. It was in 1996. And before he did that, there was a prophecy earlier on when he was a little kid that when the Awanichi left the valley, since it's their home, the whole valley walls would collapse in and destroy itself. Well, the walls didn't collapse in, but a couple weeks later, we had our 1997 flood, the biggest natural disaster here in the park. So speaking of the flood, there's a lot of water issues we have here. Thinking we know what's best for nature. As soon as this became set aside as protected land, they wanted to dig ditches to drain the meadows again for that hay and for the cattle grazing. Another thing they wanted to do was impound the river with, or actually they broke where the river was impounded by some of those moraines. Galen Clark, the first guardian of Yosemite, one of the first things he did as the guardian was blow up a moraine and let out a lot of the water and completely change the hydrology. A lot of fish and marine organisms need really diverse and complex places in the water to be, whether it be shallow or warmer or cooler or faster or slower. And when you basically make it homogeneous, that kills off that habitat. This river is basically coming down as snow melt from the High Sierra, and it's falling down really dramatically and violently, but it eventually would normally just flood the whole valley and do a braided system like that. It's called alluvial, or it brings down silt and other types of minerals from the top and deposits it, and it continually changes the course. But with the roads and the bridges, it's completely altered that. In fact, they put a bunch of stuff along the roads and bridges called riprap, and that's basically kind of all these boulders lining it, and that does not allow the stream to divert and change on its own. So we've completely rerouted the course of the Merced River here in the valley, and we're just starting to come up with a plan of how to appropriately remove it so the river can flow as it had previously, and for a lot of the plants and animals to return that have been choked out. So again, the Merced River has its start right here. This is where Bertle and Nevada Falls trailhead begins. You can go up and see the Merced River flying over the cliff twice. here. You can see how violent, again, this very fast, dramatic, white, swift water is. It's gouging out the valley as we speak. Now, the other thing with these bridges is some of these bridges are fairly narrow. If you look on the other side, the water suddenly shoots out really fast. Yeah, you can take a look behind you. Basically what's happening is kind of like if you have a hose and then you put your finger on it, right? You kind of limit how much, restrict where the water is spouting out. And so when that happens, it actually starts to vertically erode, so it gets deeper and deeper rather than distributes further and further out, creating that habitat. So some bridges are actually going to be planned to be removed too, or widened, to accommodate the river and her own will of where she wants to go. So another thing along this river is that there was also a fish hatchery over there by Happy Isles. Actually, Happy Isles is the former fish hatchery, and a lot of people wanted to fish in the park when it was created. There weren't a lot of fish because you have a natural barrier, the waterfalls and the cliffs. And so they added a bunch of trout here. Now the trout, great for the fishermen, not so great for the frogs. The trouts began to eat the frogs and compete over the same food source. So one of the most abundant frogs that early visitors talked about practically having to avoid to step on were suddenly a threatened species here in the park. But before we move on, I want you to enjoy the sound of the river here. John Muir called it the Symphony of the Sierra, of the snow melting down. So again, all of this is melted snow rushing out, trying to free and liberate itself to the Bay Area and feed you and your family. So if you're like me, you can record some of this and use it to go to bed tonight. It's very relaxing. Yeah, some of us may have recorded that, some take photos, but potentially a great opportunity for unmediated, without technology, opportunity to be present out here in nature. Again, 94% of the park is wilderness. If you just go a few miles down a trail, you won't actually see very many people. It's very busy here in the valley along the roads, but just walk a couple miles out and you'll find some nice solitude here somewhere in the park. At least before a couple weeks from now, summer kicks in. We're about to approach Mirror Lake. Mirror Lake is another place of water in the park that was modified by the early managers. Now it's called Mirror Lake because if you actually hike out there, you might get to see it reflecting Half Dome, kind of like a mirror. However, it didn't always do that, and the managers didn't like the lack of reliability. So what they decided to do is dredge it out and make it deeper to try to get more of that mirror effect. Now, in doing so, again, they completely changed that ecology of that lake. Over here, you can also see a bear trap. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And they also use some of that dredging to get sand from there to put on the roads in the winter for traction. So we're actually working on this kind of inter-organizational project to reintroduce turtles and those red and yellow-legged frogs into the park again. And the San Francisco Zoo actually bred and raised some of those frogs, and now we're getting a hold of them. We're planning on introducing thousands of turtles and frogs. So, any turtle fans out there? Yeah, yeah, turtles are pretty awesome. So yeah, this is a great place to go if you want to see that Mirror Lake. Just be careful with lots of mosquitoes. Which is one of the reasons they actually dug those ditches to drain the meadows and stuff, because people didn't like mosquitoes. But mosquitoes play an important part of the system, and the marshes bring a lot of biodiversity into the valley. So we saw that bear canister. That's a kind of another thing here. It was probably some of the worst management in the national park system's history was how we handled bears back in the day. Now, these black bears who we're dealing with now, actually most of them you'll see in the park are actually blonde. The ones out of the west are blonde. They're named black bears because the east forests are much more shaded, and so they benefit from being darker. But here we have open forests and we have pine needles, so they're brown. But yeah, we used to actually have grizzlies that lived in the valley before, again, the European settlers, Euro-Americans came through. The valley filled with grizzly bears, and the black bears lived higher up. But what happened is a lot of the settlers were not fans of the grizzly bear, were not fans of large predators, did not have the same ecological relationship with them like some of the indigenous inhabitants did. So they hunted them to extinction. So grizzly bears used to have a habitat over 1/3 of the United States, and they were quickly wiped out. Within the Sierra themselves, about 1920s, the last grizzly bear was shot to death. So once the grizzlies were basically extinguished from the valley, the black bears started coming in, and it was around that time that you had a lot of tourism, that road being built, as well as a lot of canned foods and picnickers. And the Park Service at the time thought, people love bears, you know what would be really fun? Let's actually take all the garbage that people don't eat and dump it out right next to the campground in the prairie dump. And we can watch bears eat, and isn't that cute? We can even feed them, maybe they can get them to stand up and do tricks. So at first that seemed really cute until people started to get injured, and until the bears started going to campsites to put that food in the dump. In the 40s, they said, let's go to dumps and put everything in dumpsters. The bears started to attack the dumpsters, and when they couldn't get into there, again, they went towards the campgrounds because they had become adjusted. They had learned that behavior from their parents, how to get human food. And yeah, so basically, there was a huge bear problem, and people were getting injured left and right. By the 1970s, people discovered exactly what the Park Service was doing with bears. Some hikers from the Sierra Club were up near Big Oaks Flats to the north of the Yosemite Valley, and one of them discovered a burial ground for these bears. And they found out that the Park Service here in Yosemite had killed 200 bears in just 12 years. And there was really no management policy. And the higher-ups were like, what are you doing just killing bears? This is terrible publicity. We can't just go around killing bears. We need an actual plan. So they instituted a plan in this 74 and 5 to actually track bears individually and not just indiscriminately kill the bears. You might wonder, why don't they just relocate them, right? Well, at first they were doing that in zoos and the forest, but people don't want bears that are habituated to food and get aggressive when they're not getting human food. The other thing is relocating a bear. Nowadays, if you relocate them in the park, they want to go home and they'll find their way back in a couple days. So after we started instituting all these lockers and the bear canisters that you saw in those campgrounds, and the bears eventually figured out how to open them. They just slam them up and open them up. So we had to come up with different locking systems that would automatically lock, because campers don't always like to lock things. So as soon as you shut it, it'll lock. Still problems with that today, but the locks are getting better and the bears are having a harder time figuring out how to get into them. In fact, some of these bears are so smart. We also have these canisters we require people to take out in the backcountry when they go camping. There's no more trolls. You can't hang your food from trees. The bears will get it. So these canisters that we allow in the park have been tested very professionally by basically dropping them off with grizzly bears in zoos. So if a grizzly bear in the zoo can't get in, then they're good enough for here. However, we have bears smarter than the average bear here, and one of them actually lives up that canyon there where Tenaya Creek comes in, and she's found a way to basically sneak around a campsite when someone's sleeping. She gets the canister, and she's like, and then she gets to a cliff, and it's like, whoop, falls down, bam, explodes open, and she can get that food. So we keep a special eye on her. Hopefully, we don't do anything because she's not too problematic. But another technology we've instituted after 1998, we had basically one of the worst years of bear incidents in the park. Because we started locking up all the food, the bears went to the next best thing, right? Where people kept their food sometimes they didn't. people's vehicles. And they started ripping apart the windows, getting in the back seats, ripping apart the back seat, and then getting into the trunk. So that's why we don't allow food to be in trunks overnight anymore. We actually had, in 1998, our worst year, 1.3 thousand break-ins in vehicles by bears. Cost over $650 million in damage. Sorry, $650,000 right now. Cars weren't that expensive. And so after that, we're like, hey, Congress, can we have some money? Because we kind of need that to deal with this issue. We got a bunch of money. We got wildlife technicians to study the bears. We've got more protection rangers to make sure people are complying with law. We got more interpreters like myself to educate people about bears and food. And we got nifty technological devices like radio collars and GPS units and alarms in campgrounds that would activate when a bear would enter, and we could chase them off when they did. We also got some fancy equipment. Do any of you play paintball? Any of you? Yeah. So we actually got some paintball guns. Play paintball, you know. It hurts a little bit, not all that much, especially if you have really thick skin and fur. And so it's a good way to nip the problem in the butt, literally. If a bear comes in and they're no longer afraid of you just yelling and screaming and chasing them, the paintball and loud noises are an additional measure taken to prevent the most awful thing that we could do again, and that's to put the bear down if they become bad enough to become a liability to mauling a human. So thankfully, due to that technology and visitors like yourselves kind of helping us in the campgrounds obey the rules that we've established, from 1,500 incidents in 1998, we're down to 75 last year.
Wow.
Pretty good progress, so let's keep it up. So that's one of our biggest drawbacks in the park was the bear management. It's also one of our biggest successes. So again, we kind of heard about how technology is basically opened up all kinds of new opportunities. It's let people go beyond what's thought possible with climbing. It's allowed people to access this remote, extremely beautiful place. Technology has allowed us to resolve a wildlife conflict problem with bears, but it's also created lots of problems. It's created the congestion we have here in the park. It's created and inspired some of the greed and self-interest of miners and other people who entered the area and encroached on American Indian land. And it's also literally shaped the rivers in the valley the way we will it, not the way it naturally does shape itself. So the question is, what is our experience like with technology in these national parks? What's the role of technology in enhancing our experience and detracting from it? So, something to think about is we've been managing the National Park Service, all these parks for 100 years. So we've made it this far. We've really definitely improved our management based on science. We've had a lot more foresight, but how are we going to manage them for the next 100 years? The thing is we're managing our lands. These are public lands. They belong to you. They belong to me. They're in our interests, and they're to be preserved for our future enjoyment. And so, what does it mean when we introduce new technologies to the park? We talked about some that we're removing, we're replacing, we're banning. And some of those are like drones, for instance. 2 years ago, drones were becoming a big thing to film yourself climb rock, to just get aerial views, but they also became hazards to people's safety. They've created noise pollution. They took away from the scenic vistas and wildness of places, interfered with safety and rescue operations, and so the Park Service unilaterally banned them from every park site in 2014. Should we have done that? Well, again, it's having foresight. Other technologies we have today, selfie sticks. What do we do with selfie sticks? Some people love them, some people hate them. Well, in Disney, some of those Disney parks as well as theme parks, they'd actually have banned them because people were almost causing serious accidents when they were reaching them out on roller coaster rides, right? So Will those be banned in sometime in the future, or should we keep them around? Cell phones getting Wi-Fi and cell coverage. Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? How does it affect our experience? Is it detracting from our wild experience in nature, or does it allow us to post social media and show everyone how beautiful this park is, and more people are going to support it and learn through, that kind of crowd sharing of information and photos? Speaking of photos, it's a great opportunity here. We'll be coming up to soon of Yosemite Falls. But yeah, a lot of things too, with people being able to get cell reception in the park, they begin to think, oh yeah, well if I have a problem, I can just make a call. Or I can just look up on my Google map on my phone, right? Not so much. You might be out of reception, clouds might come in and block your reception, you might run out of battery, you might not get a topo map because you won't have the data support to do it. And so some people end up doing stuff they normally wouldn't do if they didn't have these fancy technological devices we have today. So some of the new technologies developing, these are just already stuff that's been invented. But what about all the technology that hasn't been invented that could come into effect? How is that going to change our connections in the future to Yosemite Valley? How is that going to change climbing, transportation, cultural expression, art, photography? These are kind of big questions of the day. And they're going to affect really everyone who will visit these parks in the future.